My name is Michael Lisicky. I'm an oboist of the Baltimore Symphony, and I'm also the author of the book Baltimore Symphony Orchestra: A Century of Sound. In 2016, the Baltimore Symphony celebrated its 100th anniversary. And there's a lot of things you can talk about with the BSO. We can think about the last 50 years, up until 2016 when we turned 100. But we could talk about these 35 Carnegie Hall performances. We can talk about 8 international tours and over 50 recordings. But we could also even talk about the first 25 years where the Baltimore Symphony was the nation's only fully funded civic organization. I'm not going to do that today. Instead, I'm going to talk about the less talked about first, let's say, the 25 to 50 years of the Baltimore Symphony, which were important even with the development. I'm going to do so by performing or playing 3 recordings of the Baltimore Symphony. The first 3 that I can find, and what you're hearing right now is the earliest performance available of Baltimore Symphony musicians. And this is conducted by Reginald Stuart. So that's, if you're wondering what piece this is, I was wondering myself. This is the Richard Frank Donovan Suite that was performed in the mid-50s by Reginald Stuart. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Reginald Stuart before we get any farther. Reginald Stuart is the person that resurrected the Baltimore Symphony after the Baltimore Symphony disbanded in 1942 with a disagreement between the city and the musicians. The Baltimore Symphony went away. Baltimore Symphony was totally funded through public funding. And when that no longer could continue and the funding couldn't continue to a level that could expand the quality, the Baltimore Symphony went away. And it was Reginald Stuart, who was then the director of Peabody, who decided that Baltimore had to have an orchestra. And he reformed the group in the summer of 1942, and it became both a joint public-private venture. And by that fall, he had the Women's Association was formed. He had the whole charter formed. Within his tenure from 1942 on, for an entire decade, Reginald Stuart did some amazing things with the orchestra. He got an NBC national recording agreement. He took the orchestra all over the east part of the country, even took it up to Toronto, where he was originally from, and also 2 Carnegie Hall tours. The BSO premiered at Carnegie Hall, the first of 35 performances by the Baltimore Symphony at Carnegie Hall. And he even scheduled this thing where you played every piece of Brahms ever composed throughout the city of Baltimore. It even took the notice of the New York Times. That's never been done before. And he had every group, whether it be church or school or the BSO, perform every piece by Brahms. Now, Reginald Stuart's tenure ended in 1952. The constant struggles of keeping the BSO going and being able to maintain the players became too much for Stuart, and the BSO itself became a little too tense. And Reginald Stuart left in 1952 with the agreement that he would never return to the orchestra again. And I find that to be sad. Not to say that Baltimore would never have an orchestra of its own. I mean, by the late 50s, only 2 cities, large cities in this country, did not have symphony orchestras, Richmond and Fort Worth. Look at them now. But the passion and the enthusiasm that Stuart put behind it was really something of note. Now, I was playing that recording because it isn't necessarily under the guise or the name Baltimore Symphony. I'm going to play another selection from it and explain. This is Ives Camp Meeting, the first movement. This recording was not under the Baltimore Symphony label or name. It was under the Little Orchestra. Many cities across the country had organizations called the Little Symphony, basically chamber symphonies. But when Reginald Stuart lost the BSO or left the BSO, he formed the Little Orchestra, played candlelight concerts, as they called them, at Peabody, and did so for the next 6 years. Yes, you'll hear the term Little Symphony. That's different. This is Little Orchestra. And the Little Orchestra was formed by players of the Baltimore Symphony and also some faculty members from Peabody. And they, as I said, they were performing at Peabody. The candlelight concerts you hear today, the reason for candlelight was they had 2 big candelabras on the side of the stage, and all the musicians had electric candles on there too. But Stuart took it seriously, and this performance, again, 1955, after he left the BSO, was something that came out on Vanguard. I'm going to go ahead a little bit more. I hope you can hear this. This isn't really a performance for audiophiles or this program, but this is the earliest sounds or music that we have of Baltimore Symphony musicians. This is the second movement of Ives Symphony Number 3. When you research the Baltimore Symphony, you find there were some big names that were here, especially in the wind players. And even my teacher, Al Genovese, played here for a few years in the mid-50s. And that Frank Donovan piece featured Al Genovese in there. Al Genovese left to become not only principal of the Cleveland Orchestra, but also the Met before he went to the Boston Symphony, the other BSO. And this is the second movement called Arietta, which you'll have him in there. Now, I talked about Reginald Stuart leaving in 1952. In came Massimo Freccia in 1952, and he really took the city or the symphony by storm. He was international. People loved that. Stuart was British. They said he was kind of stiff. Freccia was international. He was Italian, and then he married this Cuban cigar heiress, and people they were socialites, and people were, it was the image that the BSO needed, because there were constant orchestras coming to Baltimore. Starting in 1894, the Philadelphia Orchestra had a regular series, lasted all the way till 1980. So the BSO was always seen as the second orchestra almost in town. It was also the orchestra that did most of the touring throughout the state and region, and we acted more as an ambassador to the city of Baltimore. But Massimo Freccia, as I'm going to stop this right now and go on to him a little bit more, Massimo Freccia did record the first album with the Baltimore Symphony in a performance of Rachmaninoff's Symphony Number 2. This is the first commercial recording. This was sold locally and also given to people who were taking the bus to concerts from special parking lots throughout, especially Northwest Baltimore, to come to the Lyric where they were performing, and to sign up for that, you'd get an album. So, really, the orchestra was coming to its own, though there was a little bit of a revolving door, but there were some woodwind players that really made their mark in Baltimore and with the orchestra. You had, especially with clarinet, Iggy Ganusa, who stayed in the orchestra all the way till 1970 and continued to teach at Peabody as well. In this performance of Rachmaninoff Seconds, the third movement features that clarinet solo. I'm going to put that on. I hope you can hear that well. And kind of a little quiet there, because this is one of the big clarinet excerpts in the orchestral repertoire. This was recorded in October of 1955. It was midway through Freccia's tenure. Freccia lasted until 1958. He tried to leave once, but he did leave, announced his departure in 1957. Freccia, though he did all the warhorse pieces, he said he wanted to do stuff like Mahler. The city deserved to hear Mahler. But then people were complaining that he was just doing too many of the warhorses. And, this love affair of Baltimore did come to an end. And they asked him a few years after he left, what did he miss most about Baltimore? And he said it was Shadwell and Terrapins. So I'm going to put that a little bit down. But one of the people that really took a big position in Baltimore, that still does, is Leon Fleischer. And in 1954, Leon Fleischer premiered with the Baltimore Symphony, and has remained a close ally and close friend with the orchestra over the many years. Sorry if you're an audiophile, this is a Crosley turntable that I purchased at a Dillard's in 2003. It's the best I can do right now. But after Freccia left, we had Peter Herman Adler came in. We've heard about Toscanini and the NBC Orchestra as far as especially what's televised. Well, Peter Herman Adler, not only was he an accompanist for many important vocalists, but he also was the conductor of the NBC opera orchestra that was on television. And there's a little difference between having a symphony conductor and an opera conductor, because Peter Hermann Adler really didn't know the repertoire as well, though he had a little bit of the name recognition. You hear stories about Peter Hermann Adler. When I wrote the book, one of the words that really came about to many people was spastic. And there's stories about how he fell off the podium, fell off into the viola section, and nobody knew because they knew not to look up. Principal players also had to have private sessions with him as a group at his apartment in order for him to practice conducting. And even Leon Fleischer was telling me how they were doing a concert out in, I believe it was Hagerstown, and he forgot to conduct the final note, I believe, to a Brahms piano concerto. So, yeah, I mean, so what was good about Peter Hermann Adler? I think it could, I really got to pull this out of people. I think he made some good hires for the orchestra. Vocalists, he was very strong with. And I also think it was important, that we'll get to a second, that his level of what he brought quality-wise was not strong enough to what people wanted, especially the leadership of the orchestra at the time. Let's put this on. I'm going to play a little bit of this. This isn't the first recording of Leon Fleischer that he ever participated on. It's actually his 19th. This comes from 1963, and this is the Baltimore Symphony with Peter Hermann Adler, with Leon Fleischer playing the Rachmaninoff Paganini variations. Let's see if we get it on there. With the caricature of Peter Hermann Adler on the cover. Those who are real Baltimoreans, it's drawn by Aaron Sofer, a wonderful local artist, illustrationist, cartoonist, that just had really captured the moment at the time. So, you know how Massimo Freccia said, I mean Mahler too. He said the city needed to hear Mahler too, it was good for it. But they couldn't afford it, and he felt that the city didn't want it. Adler, because he had vocal background, he did Mahler too. He also brought the symphony the next time, it was 1965, to Carnegie Hall, in a largely strange program featuring some Schoenberg choral work. Let's go ahead a little bit, and let's hear just the very ending. Oh, this isn't what I wanted to hear. This is strange. I thought I was putting something else on. This is the Blocker Variations for Orchestra. Been in the business for a little while. I've never heard this before. I'm going to change the side because I can't just push the button. And I'm going to put on the end of Mahler 2. But it's also showing the orchestra's growing a little bit repertoire-wise. Now, with Peter Hermann Adler, people were better quality. The audience and supporters were demanding better quality. So, they looked for people that could kind of lead the orchestra a little bit. And then you have the real estate developer, both commercial and residential developer, Joseph Meyerhoff, coming in. And he was approached. He wasn't a classical music person, but he was asked if he could take over the reins of the Baltimore Symphony Board of Directors in order to Got a little applause there. Let's go over to that. A little bit of Tchaikovsky 4 in the background too. One of the things that Meyerhoff knew what he had to do was replace Peter Hermann Adler in order to bring the quality up. And Adler was gone, 1967. And then we began to that big transition period of where the Baltimore Symphony is today, because Meyerhoff really just had this big attraction in the sense of like admiration for Sergio Commissiona, and that began the building process of the Baltimore Symphony as we basically know it today. And Commissiona wanted a bigger orchestra, he wanted a longer season, he wanted to really build it, and he convinced Meyerhoff to stand behind him, and that's what we have today. So yes, that for those first 25 years of the BSO, it was a civic orchestra, still geared professional. Conductors, see if I can do this. Gustav Strub, George Simone, Ernst Schelling, Walter Jansen, Howard Barlow. Then it disbands in 1942, and then we have this period that we talked about today, which is Reginald Stuart, Oslo Freccia, and Peter Hermann Adler. So in 1969, the orchestra resurrects with a performance of Mahler's Second, as we heard a little bit, tiny bit before. And then we get into the legacy of what many of you know today, with featuring the music directors, Sergio Commissiona, David Zinman, Yuri Temirkanov, and Marin Alsop. So that's a little bit what I wanted to say about these first 3 recordings of the Baltimore Symphony. Sorry that I don't have a better sound equipment, but I thought I'd just do something today. That's my dog Murphy, if you see her on the couch. And I wish everybody health and safety as we get back and get through this time. And look forward to seeing you all back at the Meyerhoff and Music Center Stratmore. Take care.
Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 4 in F minor, Opus 36.